I just have to check.
Ok.
Aqui consta que está sendo transmitida já no YouTube.
É que a gente tem um delay de 10 segundos.
Ah, tá.
Então, ok. Então, podemos iniciar.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Muito bem-vindos, muito bem-vindas. É com muito prazer que eu abro mais essa sessão mais essa edição do Roda de Conversas. Projeto que está tratando questões relacionadas à sustentabilidade. Eu gostaria de saudar a minha colega e amiga, professora doutora Katrin Rosenfield, que tem coordenado as nossas conversas. Muito obrigado, Katrin, por essa iniciativa, por esse projeto e pela tua excelente condução. Eu te passo a palavra e uma boa sessão a todos nós.
Muito obrigada, Drayton. Eu tenho o grande prazer de apresentar hoje aqui o Charles B. Duff, um urbanista de Baltimore que se notabilizou durante os seus 30 anos, ou mais de 30 anos de trabalho de recuperação de bairros históricos muito degradados de Baltimore e de integração de novas construções e todo um novo ar, né, que sopra em Baltimore, que se tornou de uma cidade muito degradada e muito abandonada, né, num dos centros urbanos de qualidade de vida superior nos Estados Unidos. Então, eu tive o grande prazer de presenciar pessoalmente, né, o trabalho que ele realizou lá, tanto em bairros de classe média, né, de recuperação, como em bairros com grandes problemas sociais, né, com essa divisão entre bairros negros e brancos, e ele também teve a iniciativa de vir a Porto Alegre 2 vezes, ele já falou na prefeitura uns 10 anos atrás, 2 vezes sobre problemas urbanos, né, que ele observou aqui e lá. E nessas conversas nós descobrimos que Porto Alegre, na verdade, é uma cidade irmã de Baltimore, e por boas razões, porque essas duas cidades têm uma configuração geológica muito semelhante, com uma imensa baía, uma frente para a água. Então, tem uma série de semelhanças, apesar de todas as diferenças que são evidentes, né, entre a América do Norte e o nosso país. Os outros participantes são a bem conhecida Rovana Bortolini, que já esteve na nossa primeira palestra, ou na verdade protagonizou a nossa primeira palestra, junto com o secretário de Planejamento e Meio Ambiente. O senhor Rodrigo Tortoriello, que é secretário extraordinário de Mobilidade Urbana, e Fábio Bervanga Juliano, que é o presidente do EPTC, né, um departamento muito importante que se empenha, né, na maior difusão, né, do transporte e ordenação, né, do transporte público e individual. E eu tomei a liberdade de convidar também a Carol Correia, que é uma pesquisadora de pós-doutorado na nossa universidade, na URGS, e trabalha com partidos de meio ambiente na Câmara dos Deputados. Então, sem mais, eu passo a palavra para Charles Duff. Charlie, you have the word for your PowerPoint.
I have to work. It's time to start?
Yes, it's time to start.
Oh, lovely. Well, thank you all very much. If you are like me, you probably read lots of things and hear lots of talks by people from Europe and Asia. And they talk about what they have done for the environment and for urban sustainability. And if you're like me, you say, wow, think of all the amazing things that they're doing over there. I wish we could do some of that. Well, I'm not from Europe and I'm not from Asia. I'm from America and you're from America. And as far as I can tell, we Americans, whether we're North Americans or South Americans, are lagging behind Europe and much of Asia in urban sustainability. So if you're expecting that I'm going to say, we are better than you are, we do wonderful things, come be like us, well, I'm not going to say that. We have lots and lots of problems, and you probably have lots and lots of problems, and none of us are in Switzerland, and none of us are in Sweden, and we aren't even in Paris. So what I'm going to share with you is some of our experience in an American city that has not solved all of its problems of sustainability and is not even working on some of the most important problems. But we have made some progress. Our issues are similar to yours, but they're also different. And maybe I can help. First, let me just ask a simple question. Am I talking too fast? Can you understand me? Let me look down and look at everybody here.
I think yes.
Can you understand? That's good. Okay, good. That makes life easy. Okay, well, my city is Baltimore in the state of Maryland on the Chesapeake Bay, which is a big lagoon like the beautiful Guaíba. It's funny. Wait a minute, now I need to, why isn't this working? There we go. I have to do it a different way today. The first time I went to Porto Alegre in 2007, I met a man named Antonio Custodio, and he showed me a PowerPoint of what he wanted Porto Alegre to be in the future. The very first picture in his PowerPoint was Baltimore Harbor, as it was in 2007. Here is Baltimore Harbor as it was in 2017. Baltimore is a port city like Porto Alegre, and it has a lot of new development and spectacular water, and the water is fun to use. As you can see, lots of people have boats on it. And if you have expensive office space, you want to be near the water. If you have expensive condominiums, you want to be on the water, or expensive hotels, you want to be on the water. That wasn't always the case because our water used to be very, very dirty and full of small, dirty steamships. But now the water is much cleaner and people want to be close to the water, and we've become a waterfront city. Let me see if this works. There we go. People often say that Baltimore is two cities. They say one Baltimore is a successful city, and the successful part of Baltimore is beautiful and historic. Here is one of my favorite little streets in town, but I have lots of favorite streets. Baltimore is a beautiful, historic city, and much of it is very successful. The metropolitan area of Baltimore is the 5th richest metropolitan area in the whole United States. The United States is a rich country, and it has lots of rich metropolitan areas like San Francisco and Boston and Washington. But it also has Baltimore, and Baltimore is one of the 5 richest metropolitan areas in the United States. And that's useful. It means that if we can agree on what to do and who's going to do it, the money exists to do it. But can we agree on what we should do, and can we agree on who's going to do it? Not always. And that's why Baltimore is also, let me see if this works, this is a very different setup, is also an ugly, failing city. There are about 20,000 empty houses in Baltimore. And these houses were once beautiful 19th century houses in the English manner. But there are now thousands and thousands of houses that are vacant like this. And they have been empty for a long time. Why is that? For the simple reason that people don't want to live in them. They don't want to live in those areas in the city. And that is a problem. So people often say that Baltimore is two cities, a beautiful, successful city, and an ugly, failing city. They're basically right. Um, Baltimore is a global port, as Porto Alegre is. And great ships come from all over the world to Baltimore. So, as you know, if you're a port, much of your land is at sea level. And that can be a problem as sea levels begin to rise. And Baltimore is already beginning to see flooding in some of its waterfront neighborhoods. And the waterfront neighborhoods are usually the most beautiful and historic neighborhoods in the city, but they're at sea level. And in Porto Alegre, you probably know what that's like. At any rate, we're all going to learn what that's like, and it's going to be terrible. So in many ways, Baltimore is a city like Porto Alegre. I've been to Porto Alegre four times. I feel very much at home there. In part, that's because Catherine has been my hostess, and I always feel at home in Catherine's house and with Catherine's family. But also, Porto Alegre is a very similar city to ours. In one respect, you have an advantage over us in that you are more compact, you are more dense. It is easier for people to walk places or take public transportation. But I'm not sure it really works much better in Porto Alegre than it does in Baltimore for various reasons. But very, very similar cities in many respects, good old port cities. Baltimore is part of the United States. If you're wondering how the United States produces greenhouse gases, here is the national breakdown. My guess is that Baltimore is pretty similar. You'll notice that 31% of it is from generating electricity. We're a hot climate and a cold climate. We need a lot of heating, we need a lot of cooling, and we have a lot of electric lights, and we're very wasteful. And now people are beginning to buy electric cars. So an awful lot of our greenhouse gases come from electricity. There are no electricity power plants in Baltimore, but Baltimore gets 2/3 of its air pollution from coal-fired power plants in other states, in states out to the west of us. The smoke from those power plants blows over the east coast of the United States. Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia, New York, we get 2/3 of our greenhouse gases from Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, places out, Indiana, places out to the west of us. We make a lot of greenhouse gases by driving cars. And if there's anything that we Americans are really terrible about, it's driving cars. Our industry creates 21% of the problem. And then you get two other things that nobody ever really talked about until the last 2 or 3 years. You've probably read the big UN report on what causes greenhouse gases. If you were like me, you were surprised to see that food waste was 10% of global greenhouse gas production. You were surprised to see that cattle was a high percentage of it. We don't have any cattle in the city of Baltimore, but we do eat beef and we do eat pork and we do eat chicken. And so in that sense, we're part of the problem. As late as 1900, Baltimore was a sustainable city by modern standards. This is a typical Baltimore street for the upper middle classes or the rich in the 19th century. It is beautiful if you like this kind of thing, which I do. This is my street. But think about the density of it. It's at 45 houses per hectare. And that's how the rich were living in 1900. And that was almost enough to support commercial districts within walking distance, not quite. That was the rich. The working classes lived somewhat more densely, at about 130 houses per hectare. And you'll notice that whether people were rich or whether they were working class, they lived in houses. Baltimore is not a city of apartment buildings. America is not a country of apartment buildings except in New York. We have some apartment buildings, but they're not typical. And people think that it is unusual and bad to raise children in an apartment building. We think that apartment living is for the young and for the old. And if you're a real family, you're supposed to live in a house. And that house may be freestanding, but in Baltimore City, it's probably what we call a row house. Because these houses are connected to each other, we call them row houses. The British call them terraced houses. They're the same thing. The Dutch invented them, and the Dutch just call them houses. And in 1900, and for a while later, Baltimore had a robust public transport system. The Baltimore transport system in the first half of the 20th century was electric streetcars, electric trams. It then went over to buses. But at the beginning of the 20th century, it was very strong, and most people got most places either by walking or by riding on electric trams. What do you call them? Trams, streetcars? Oh, I can't hear you, Catherine. Okay, I'll just go on. But then along came the 20th century. And the 20th century, at least in America, and I think in the world, is unsustainable. It is the enemy of sustainability. If you want to know where this begins in the United States, it begins in Detroit. If you want to know when it begins in 1913. 1913 was the year that Henry Ford created the first assembly line for cars. And here are Model T Fords coming down the assembly line in Detroit. Assembly line production of cars made cars cheap, made it possible for a wide range of Americans to buy cars. By contrast, in England, you did not get assembly line production of cars until 1930. And if you wonder why England is more sustainable, why British cities are easier to live in without a car, it's because all of the construction that happened in the 1920s, a tremendous amount of construction after World War I, all of that happened for cars in America and for buses and underground trains in England. Big, big difference. So after 1913, America becomes an automotive country, or begins to become an automotive country. And instantly you see it in the development pattern of Baltimore. People stop building row houses. These are working class suburban houses from the 1920s. And there are only 11 of them on each hectare. So you do not have enough density for people to walk to shops. You don't have enough density for people to walk to work. You need to have a car. This neighborhood is obviously not working class anymore because the car is a BMW. But this is what happened to working class people in Baltimore when they were able to buy cheap cars made by Henry Ford. They began to live at densities that required car ownership. Car ownership is not optional at 13 houses per hectare. You really need to own a car. After World War II, things get worse. Car production becomes bigger. The people get richer in America. America is unimaginably rich in the 40 years after World War II. Almost everybody buys a car, and people care much more about their cars than they do about their houses. And their cars are much fancier than their houses are. But when everybody has a car, all of a sudden, everybody can live at suburban density, and you get mass suburbia, suburbia for everybody. And this is an aerial view of post-war suburbia. This does not happen to be a suburb of Baltimore, but it could be. This is, we have plenty of neighborhoods that look like this. This is post-war suburbia, and most of us live that way. The people who live in post-war suburbia used to live in the city. And in the 1950s and 60s, they moved out of the city. And the population of the city began to decline, and houses went empty. Whole neighborhoods went empty. And whole neighborhoods were abandoned. We speak of abandonment. Here are houses from the 18th century, nice historic houses, that were abandoned when I took this picture in 1975. And you can see it statistically. Post-war suburbia drained the city of people. In 1950, the city, which has a mayor and city council, had 1 million people, and the suburbs, which were 3 different counties with their own governments, had only 0.3 million people, only 300,000 people. So the city was by far the biggest part of the metropolitan area in 1950. But by 2010, which was the last census, boy, everything was so different. For one thing, the metropolitan area had doubled in size. The city is successful. The metropolitan area is successful. The metropolitan area is now 2.7 million people. But look what happened to the population of the city. It fell from 1 million to 320,000 people. And when that happened, only the poorest people were left. And so if you look at, in America, white people on average are a great deal richer than Black people. If you have a television, you probably realize that. And I think it's pretty much true in Brazil. Baltimore City is now 60% Black and 40% white or brown or yellow. And on average, Black people make less money and own less wealth than white people or brown people or yellow people. So the city is pretty poor. But the metropolitan area is very rich. And it's 72% white, brown, and yellow, only 28% Black. And most of the Black people in the whole metropolitan area live in the city. So the city is this weird thing. It is a poor city in a rich metropolitan area. And as you experience, the city is one government. And then when you get outside, you have 5 different governments, and they don't like to share. And a poor city in America is often a dangerous city. And my Baltimore, which I love dearly, is one of the most dangerous cities in the United States. Last year, we had 342 murders, and that works out to 55 murders for every 100,000 people. Wait a minute, let me turn off my telephone here. I thought I had done that. Oh, stop it. So Baltimore, this funny place, the part success, part failure, and the city itself is quite poor and quite violent. So we have a lot of problems. And when you have a lot of poor people, when you have a lot of crime, sustainability is not the first thing that most people think about. Most people think about making a living if they're poor, locking their doors if they're rich. People think about crime. If you're Black, you think about bringing about racial justice. And sustainability is not our highest priority. We've not had forest fires yet. We have not had catastrophic flooding. Those things are beginning to happen in other parts of the country. We have not had them yet. And so sustainability is not a high priority for city government in Baltimore. And it is certainly not a priority for the governments in the suburbs, where most people are white and pretty prosperous, and they don't want to share their money with the city. And needless to say, we're not getting much help from the US government in Washington. Sustainability is not a high priority of the Trump administration. Enough said? Right. You know what that's like. But we have done some things. And we're by no means perfect, but we've done some things. For one thing, we have begun to make certain parts of the city denser than they used to be. And we started with the city center, what we call downtown. Here is an aerial view of downtown Baltimore in 1950. Very good. There is the same view in 1980. You have twice as much building on the land. Downtown Baltimore doubled in size, doubled in density between 1950 and 1980. And that means that if you can get people to live within walking distance of their work or to live downtown, you have a greater potential for a sustainable city. And here is downtown today. Downtown is now twice as big as it was in 1980. And although it has spread out some, it's now about 3 kilometers across, still there are a lot of jobs that you can walk to, and there are a lot of houses and a lot of apartments that are within walking distance of them. 40 years ago, there were only about 2,000 people living in the center of Baltimore, even though they could afford to live in the suburbs. Today, there are 60,000, and that's a big difference. We're beginning to change fashion so that middle-class people, people who can afford a car, are choosing to live in high-rise buildings, are choosing to live in row houses, are choosing to live in sustainable neighborhoods. We're beginning to change that, beginning to change fashion, which is important. Hold on, yep. And so if you'll remember, here's an abandoned neighborhood in 1975. By 1980, that neighborhood was getting rebuilt. And by 1985, it was beautiful. And it looked, if you're an American, you look at this, and it looks like the heroic past of colonial America and the Revolution and the Founding Fathers. And we have a lot of that. And we had abandoned a lot of it by 1975. We have rebuilt a lot of it since, and a lot of people want to live in it. And all over the old city, you find people who are buying houses in old, dense, sustainable neighborhoods, even though the people can afford to live in post-war suburbia if they want to. And here's a neighborhood that I love. You can tell that the neighborhood is full of people who are there because they want to be there. And they painted their houses in funny colors, in competition with each other and in collaboration with each other. And that's happening a lot. That's happening a lot in all, not all American cities, but certainly in the lucky American cities. And Baltimore's pretty lucky in that respect. And we're restoring sustainability by building new neighborhoods of high density, a lot of them. We have built about 12,000 high density apartments in the last 10 years, even though we had a major recession at the beginning of that 10-year period. And there are now large parts of Baltimore where you can live almost as if you were in Porto Alegre at high density. So this is new for Baltimore, but we're doing it, and it's more sustainable than usual. And then another thing, and I'm acutely conscious of this because I am a property developer as well as a city planner. I build buildings and I rebuild buildings. We have built or rebuilt about 300 buildings in my career. And the changes in building techniques and building codes have been wonderful. This is LEED, which is the American Standard for Energy Efficient Design and Construction. And I love this picture. Here you see 2 houses. The house on the left has looked like that since 1880. The house on the right was rebuilt in 2011. And they are identical houses. But the fellow who owns the old house on the left got to know his neighbor in the newly rebuilt house on the right. And at the end of the first year, they compared their heating and electric bills. And the reconstructed house cut energy use by 80%. And maybe the most significant thing that we Americans are doing is building codes for sustainability. And I am just amazed, the apartment houses that we build today, our tenants pay so little for electricity, so little for heat. It's really quite wonderful. That's one thing we're doing right. We are helping to restore sustainability by creating bicycle infrastructure. But if you'll see, there are not a lot of bikes. I stood out here the other day, it was a Saturday, beautiful day, waiting for somebody to come along on a bike. I eventually got bored, took a picture of the bike lane and left. So we're beginning to build bike infrastructure, but it hasn't really caught on yet. Maybe it will, but it hasn't really caught on yet. I think it might be difficult in a dangerous city. People are afraid, a car is sort of like the suit of armor that a medieval knight wore. It is protective, and a bike is not like a suit of armor. And then water pollution is a big piece of it. The Baltimore sewer system is 110 years old, and it's leaking, and it's very bad for Chesapeake Bay. We are spending $2 billion rebuilding the sewer system. That's a very expensive thing for everybody who uses the water and sewer system. Big, big deal. And we're building a metro line. We have built a metro line, a good modern 30-kilometer underground line, works beautifully. And we're planning a full system, a full 150-kilometer system. And if we get this built, that will help a lot. We will then be set up like Boston or like Washington. And these cities have the potential to be quite sustainable. So far, so good. But I said at the beginning of the talk that we were not Sweden or Switzerland or even Paris. We're by no means perfect. There are some places where we're getting a little better, but not much. And one of them is trees. You need trees to be cool. Trees are a wonderful thing. And we're planting more of them, but not many. Our tree canopy in the last 10 years went from 27% all the way up to 28%. Ooh, not a lot. And meanwhile, in the suburbs, people are chopping down trees all the time to build new suburbia. If you look at this map, you'll see that some parts of it are green and some are not. The green are where there are trees, and you'll notice that those are at the outskirts. Also at the outskirts, you tend to find most people who have money. And in Baltimore and in America generally, trees are a luxury. Only rich people seem to care about trees. So if you go through the prosperous parts of Baltimore, you can find unbelievably beautiful tree stands like this all over the place. But if you go into poor neighborhoods, and Baltimore is quite typical of America in this, you might not have any trees at all. At all. And in large parts of Baltimore, the good, stable, old working class people don't like trees because they don't like to rake leaves. They think the trees are dirty. It's a problem. Something we tried, and for a while it worked, was curbside recycling. I take out my recycling every week. We recycle 1.5 million tons a month or something, a lot. But recently, people have stopped buying our recycling. So now when we recycle, the city has to dump it in the landfills. And here you see trash being dumped in a landfill. Much of what we're dumping could be recycled, but nobody wants to buy, and we're recycling. We citizens are recycling, but nobody wants to buy what we recycle. And an awful lot of people are just careless. Particularly in poor neighborhoods, you get an awful lot of trash, illegal dumping of trash. And here you get one woman who's so mad about it that she called me and got me out, come out to her alley and see if there was anything I could do about it. Well, there was something I could do about it that day. We got it carted off, but there was more trash the next week. This is a problem. Here's another thing we're failing at. You remember I showed you that beautiful metro system that we were planning? Well, that's great, but we're not building it. We built one system, and then we've got a tram line, but we now have a Republican governor. And 3 years ago, he ended construction on the next underground line. So we're not going to build it, at least probably not in my lifetime. We may never build it at all, which would be a terrible thing. And we are still mainly a suburban part of the United States. Most Americans now live in the suburbs. if you are following our presidential election this year, you may be reading that the suburbs are the political battleground this year. Well, they should be, because most Americans live in the suburbs, and most people in the metropolitan area of Baltimore still live in post-war suburbia. This is a very, very, very wasteful way to live. You have an enormous amount of heating and cooling because the houses don't touch each other. You have an enormous amount of driving. People have to drive everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And most people still live like this. And the worst of all is we're still building it. We're still building a lot of it. It's not all as ugly as this. I chose this picture because I thought the house was really ugly. And I wanted to show that we build really ugly suburban houses. They're not all this ugly, but they're all wasteful. And our lots continue to get bigger and bigger, which means that people need to drive farther and they need to drive more often. So there we are from your sister city by the Chesapeake Bay, Baltimore, a city that used to be sustainable, became unsustainable, and is now doing some things right and some things wrong, and by no means doing enough, doing nowhere near enough. And I would bet that you are doing some things that we could learn from, and I would love to learn them. So that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Charlie. This was a very enlightening talk and gave us very much food for thought. So I'm asking Rodrigo, Rovana, Fabio, if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will come in with a couple of questions. Rodrigo.
Muito obrigado, Mr. Duff, pela apresentação, pelo material. E nós vemos que temos um desafio muito grande.
So this is a very great challenge for us.
Well, should we go in English? Is it okay for...
Well, if it's okay for you, okay. I think that the public understands. If you speak slowly, it's no problem for people to understand.
Oh, okay.
And it's okay with me.
Okay, great. So we've seen that the challenges are huge because you have poverty, you have violence, you have, talking about urban mobility, you have a modal split that's basically, that relies basically on private cars. Mm-hmm. So since you're not going to be able to increase your metro lines in a short time, mm-hmm. Is there any plan to have, not only on rail, but are you planning to have a efficient bus system like the BRTs or something like that, that could improve the public transportation and could help people from Baltimore to change from private cars to BRTs, even though that suburbans wouldn't change, but about to have the change in the downtown area or in the city to start this approach for public transportation instead of private transportation. Do you have anything planned like that or not yet?
Well, it's worse than that. Before I began to talk, you were talking about how it was a problem that the city of Porto Alegre had one transportation system and the outlying areas had a different system or several different systems. Well, we have the opposite problem. We have only one system for the whole metropolitan area. But there are many more people in the suburbs than there are in the city. And they're voting citizens and they put up most of the money. And they don't really care very much about urban mobility. They care about whether they can commute to their jobs. So we have good bus service and 2 good rail lines, that take people from the suburbs downtown to their jobs. But nobody seems to realize here that urban transportation is really different from commuter transportation. You know, there's one person in the city's Department of Transportation here who I think understands this, mainly because he's from Paris. But nobody else seems to understand it, and nobody in the Transportation Authority seems to understand it, and they have no incentive to understand it because urban service, most of the people who pay for the system don't use it. Most of the people who pay for the system live in the suburbs. And when they think about the city, they mainly think of poor, dangerous Black people, and they don't care what happens to them. You know, there are now tens of thousands of middle-class people who are living in the city, but they haven't really made they're still only 10% of the city population that is middle-class people living at high density. And as for the poor really need a good transportation system. The poor really can't afford cars. It's like being in Brazil. And if you are a poor Baltimorean and you need to go somewhere and then transfer and go somewhere else, it can take an hour and a half to go 4 miles or 7 kilometers or something. It's just horrible. So why is there not a big political constituency for better transit? Mainly because that's not the only problem the poor face, and that's not the only problem Blacks face. And it's hard for poor people, it's hard for Black people to focus on transportation when they have bigger problems like, say, getting killed by the police. So we have reformed our bus system in the last 3 years so that it's more, we used to run buses on too many streets, so you didn't have much service on any one street, and we fixed that. But we still just don't run enough buses. In 1970, our system had 1,400 buses. Today, our system has 800 buses. And you just can't make a good transfer. How many buses are there in the city of Porto Alegre?
Rodrigo, how many buses are there?
1,500. Right.
Well, that's what we need. That's about right.
Not running right now because of the pandemia. We don't have the full fleet working, but the whole fleet is around 1,500.
Yeah, and that's the right number for Baltimore. That's what we should have, and we have half that.
Oh.
It's bad.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as for BRT, I would like to, I've talked to Jamie Lerner about this, and I'd like to talk to you about this. Our streets aren't very wide. I look at the pictures of streets of Curitiba, they're really wide. And our streets are much narrower than that. It would be hard to do. We could probably do it, but it would be hard. At any rate, we're not trying. We know that it exists, but we're not trying.
Thank you very much, Def.
Well, I would like to transfer a question for both with, something Charlie mentioned and which has been mentioned in a talk I had with Carol Correa. One of the topics Charlie addressed was the question of recycling, that there is a recycling policy, that it worked for a while, as it seems to work or worked in Porto Alegre. People really are recycling and are putting things apart, the garbage. But then, apparently in the statistics, you see that the implementation 10 years after the law is not really perfect.
Sorry, Catherine, thank you. I can talk. Yes, of course, thank you. Primeiro, eu gostaria de agradecer o convite. Muito obrigada, é uma honra estar aqui hoje. Muito obrigada. Mr. Charles, thank you so much for your presentation, your explanation. I learned a lot, so thank you so much. You talked about many points that are so important in the Brazilian reality. So especially recycling policy and public transportation. And Rodrigo already talked about public transportation. So I would ask you about recycling policy. This is a serious problem here in Brazil. We have a specific legislation about solid waste management. This law completed 10 years this year, but in practice, there is no perfect implementation of this law in Brazil. Brazil still have approximately 3,000 open dumps or dump in a landfill. So this is a serious problem because we know all the consequences that this can have on the environment and on people's health. So my question is related to this difficulty of implementing waste management in different places around the world. So, what are practical alternatives that you think are possible to be implemented about this?
Well, the most practical alternatives are to produce less waste. That's the best thing, or to produce waste that is biodegradable. This very week, the state of Maryland made it illegal to have styrofoam packaging. And that's a very good thing. You know, the city has just passed a law that you cannot get free plastic bags at a food store. And that's a good thing. So when you buy something in America, it has a lot of packaging around it, just a huge amount of stuff. I don't know why, but it does. It would help if we simply produced less waste. Recycling is, I think, easy to do if you're willing to pay for it. It is, you know, people think that it's free. It's not free. It costs a lot of money to turn a tin can into tin. It costs a lot of money to turn a newspaper into paper. So the things that American cities and states are beginning to do is to require that, you know, state governments buy 10% of their paper and recycled products, and that to create a market for it. And we're doing some of that. The people of Baltimore really got into recycling and did a lot of recycling, and we do a lot of recycling. Middle-class people do it more than poor people, but the city government took it very seriously, and the city government gave every single family a big yellow recycling bin, and people use them. And you know, but the problem is that that nobody is buying the recycled material. We also, there's something I should have mentioned, and this is controversial here, and you may or may not have experience with it. We have a big plant farther downtown that burns trash to make electricity, and makes a lot of electricity. And it has one smokestack, and you can have scrubbers, and you can clean the emissions pretty well. So that's one thing we can do. And some people think that's terrible, and some people think it's the solution. Have you tried that?
Rovana, may I add a question to that? Because I've heard from an engineer that there was a project in the 50s or 60s to transform our usina do gasômetro into a plant which would recycle garbage in order to produce heat or electricity or whatever. And you know that the sort of technological idea was ready and seemed to be absolutely viable, feasible, but then for political reasons that didn't get off the ground. Have you any information about that? Because that, you know, it's sort of the same question, Charlie.
Hi, no, I haven't this information. I really don't know about this subject. We don't know.
Oh. Yep.
I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there are so many other things, you know, Charlie mentioned from so many ideas of clean energy which come from Asia. So also by chance and just by talking to people who are more informed than I am, I recently learned about the garbage enzyme. You know, we produce so much very hurtful waste because of our cleaning systems, you know, the sort of consumerism for cleaning stuff. Which is utterly useless because, you know, it doesn't disinfect more than you can disinfect with less. And in Asia, they make from garbage, you know, from sort of food and fruit and vegetable garbage, they make enzymes which degrade the cleaning products. So you could, you know, the same way we use the garbage system, you know, the papeleros, our people who collect the garbage and sell it. We could actually produce this enzyme, which would be an incredible help, probably also to clean the wasted areas, the dump, you know, the dump heaps, if that were produced in large quantities. But I mean, it's really, as Charlie said, it's wonderful ideas which are around and which have not been collected, it seems, by institutions or research centers. And you know, the whole problem is not that there aren't technologies, but there is no link between, it seems, between the administrational side, the city councils and so on, and these ideas, which then remain on a very small level, you know, just by well-meaning people, like Charlie said, you know, the sort of people from the middle class who play around with these ideas.
Let me see if I can find a picture and get this on the screen. I don't know if this will work, but let me see if I can try something.
And then there is a commentary, while you look for it, there is a commentary from our public. Lucas Bittencourt writes here: espero que a administração da cidade escute o senhor Duff, principalmente no que toca à população pobre e negra que vive nas periferias metropolitanas, longe dos privilégios classe médio-cêntricos. Mas isso é apenas um comentário. O Lucas não quer entrar assim nos detalhes do que ele quer dizer com privilégios mediocêntricos.
Help me with the question, please.
Well, there was just a commentary by some of our listeners who hopes that our city administration will listen to you and sort of not restrain all of the benefits to the middle class, but also to the people who live in suburbs. So he didn't quite get your idea, you know, that because in Brazil, you know, suburbia is not what you call suburbia. It's the poorer people who live further away in the suburbs, and they depend a lot on public transport.
Very different.
But maybe also Rodrigo can enlighten us a little bit more, because you know, when in 2012 and 13, you know, there has been this incentive for poor people to buy cars, and at that moment, the use of public transportation dropped dramatically. So people who used to take the bus in those years, you know, 2012 and 13, all of a sudden invaded the city with their private transport. So very often it's not that, you know, because we have a good public transport system that people use it, but only because they don't have the money to use the, I don't know, I'm talking a little bit as a Lego here, you know, as a, but maybe Rodrigo can enlighten us a little bit more about the logic, you know, of who uses really the public transport, and also the other thing which Charlie commented, whether bicycles are an option in a city like Porto Alegre, which is hot in summer and cold in winter.
Yes, we had from the national government, we have signals or policies that were against each other, let's say. If we think that in 2012, we had the bill that was relative to, it was the Urban National Mobility Bill, okay, in 2012, a Lei de Mobilidade Nacional. At the same time, we had taxes subside, like IPI, that were reduced for private cars, so people could buy their cars. And in this bill that was passed, it says the first is the people, second, bike, third, public transportation, fourth, cargos, and fifth was the private cars. So if on one hand we have a policy that should prioritize walking movement, walking trips, bike trips, and public transportation trips. On the other hand, we had a policy to increase economy, or supposedly increase economy, based on discounts for buying cars and regulating the price of gas to drop the price, not following the international prices, but dropping the price artificially. So it doesn't make any sense when you have a policy that says one thing for mobility, and you have a policy in our economy that says another thing that's totally opposite of the main objective of the bill, the urban mobility bill. So what we saw in those years was an increase in car fleet, automobile fleet, motorcycles fleet, and the increase of congestion, pollution, and accidents. So
It sounds wonderful.
It was really wonderful.
So at least we have enough job. We can complain that we don't have job to do. So for us that deal with urban mobility and traffic, and we have a lot of job because our policies were in conflict in the past. So right now there's even though we're not talking about national government, because there is no policy at all for urban mobility. In fact, the department of the federal department of urban mobility was totally devastated. It's a small department now in another ministry. But anyway, talking about what local governments are doing, and the COVID-19 was an opportunity to increase those measures, was like to improve the use of bike, to improve the usage of bus-only lanes, and we are doing that in Porto Alegre. So we as a governance policy, we are trying to prioritize public transportation in order to have a bigger ridership, because the ridership is falling all over the years, all over those past years. And we're trying to increase bus ridership. We're trying to put some technology on the buses, like that we have the GPS, we have an application that people can find the time that the bus will stop at the bus stop, and you have more confidence of using the public transportation. You have reducing the trip lengths and the travel time, reducing the travel time by using those bus-only lanes in the peak hours. Then we go to rebuild and to have new bus stops with light security cams, that we have a concession process that's undergoing. So there's some measures that together they can put a new standard for public transportation. But again, we still have to send this message more clear for our population, to try to make them understand that it's a new priority, it's a new policy, and hopefully we expect that whoever wins the elections now in November, that keep this policy, because it doesn't matter what kind of government. It's not a problem of right or left side of the politicians. Yeah. It's a matter of a problem of the city that needs to have a better public transportation, to have a more affordable public transportation. And this question that I forgot the name of the guy that asked the comment that he made.
Lucas.
Lucas. So Lucas, we are trying to reduce the cost of transportation exactly for those that are more less rich or more poor, that really need to use the public transportation, not only for go to work, but also to go to the Orla to visit the new area that was mainly rebuilt for people, and people need to visit and to use this infrastructure. It's a very, very nice urban area. Most of the cities in Brazil don't have a place like that to be used, but it's not only for those who live around the Guaíba's shore to visit. It's for those who live in the city. So this is why we're trying to do this huge movement that is unpopular for middle classes and rich people that own cars, because we're taking the space of their cars with the bus-only lanes. We are trying to charge a congestion charge to subsidize the public transportation, and they don't like it. This is why you see all of these people from middle and high class saying that we are taking their space, and actually we're trying to give back space to people in the city, not taking back from anyone, but to equalize and use the space as in a democratic way.
Sorry, Catherine, I have a quick comment, really quick, about this that Rodrigo talked about. I have a quick comment because nowadays we have another problem. We have platforms like Uber and Cabify that sometimes are cheaper for the population, are cheaper than riding a bus or a train. This is another problem.
Big problem.
Just
picking up this question, just hold on. I want to put a question by Giovanna Hess, who wants you to comment on these problems. And I would like to add one little thought. When you talk in Baltimore about making an underground, who is paying for it? Because, you know, we have a very peculiar public transport system. It's private companies which have a concession with the, Rodrigo, please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's private companies which have some kind of agreement with the municipality who run the public transport system. And that makes it a little bit expensive if you compare it to European underground systems and so on. So I would like you first to comment a little bit, you know, how this financial side of the public transport is being treated in Baltimore, and then Rodrigo comment a little bit about this conundrum, this difficulty we have in Brazil of private companies having sort of taken over almost a monopoly on the transportation system. I think this is one of the administrative sides which has to be enlightened a little bit more.
Okay, well, I'll go first because you asked me to go first. In Baltimore and in every American city that I know, public transport is owned by some kind of government. None of it is private. In Baltimore, the bus system and the underground, the metro, are owned by the state. And the state is rich and the city is poor, so the state could afford to do that. And when we were getting ready to build a new underground line 5 years ago, the state was going to pay the $3 billion to do it. But then we elected a Republican governor who stopped doing it. And that's a Republican priority. So that's unlikely to happen, at least for a long time. But it's all owned by the state. And we have another problem, which is that that state agency is part of a larger state agency. And the larger state agency also controls things that are much more important to most people. It controls the airport. It controls the Port of Baltimore. And it also controls all the roads and highways owned by the state. So all of those things are generally thought to be more important than urban mobility. And so the part of the State Department that runs urban mobility is a minor part of it, and it's just not a big political deal because almost everybody in the state rides on roads and they fly from the airport, but very few people ride Baltimore City buses.
Mm-hmm. Ok, Rodrigo, tu pode falar pouquinho dessa coisa do público e privado do transporte público aqui?
Okay.
English, otherwise you won't understand us.
Our public transportation system is a concession. So it's state-owned, but privately run it. And we have one company that's it's CARRIS, that is a state-owned company. So we have 4 consortiums plus CARRIS running the 1,500 buses in Porto Alegre. Well, CARRIS doesn't have the better standards or numbers compared with the private owned companies. The private owned companies are usually much more efficient to run the system than the state owned company. Okay, so I think that the problem is not being private or public. The problem is in Brazil, as is not a problem of Porto Alegre. The problem is we don't have any kind of policy to finance the system, national policy to finance the system. Okay, if in Europe, some countries like France, the ticket that you pay represents only 40% of the total cost of the metro system, to run the metro system, not for investment. In Brazil, 100% or even more, because the free passes are costed by those who pay the fare. So 100% of the fare it's to cover the operation of the bus system.
Okay.
So this is the main problem that makes our system more expensive. And Carol, compared to the ride-hailing systems, those Cabify, Uber, all of those platforms, if those platforms were the solution for public transportation, there would be no complaints, no concerns, no any problem during the pandemic, because those private companies would serve the people and make everything easy and everything would work. And we wouldn't be talking about public transportation now, because there was a big problem that changed our life. But it didn't. As we used to say, as technicians of the public transportation system, we used to say those platforms, they will not replace public transportation. There is no city like Baltimore, Porto Alegre, New York City, Brasilia, São Paulo that will survive without public transportation. There's no way to live without it. So what I believe is a system that could be integrated, that could talk with each other, but also those platforms in Europe and in the United States, they pay some kind of taxes and they are regulated by the city. Over here, they don't want to be regulated at all, and they don't want to pay any kind of taxes. Why they respect the law in the United States and don't respect the law in South America?
I totally agree with you, Rodrigo. I totally agree. Yes.
We don't want to run the system. We don't want to block the market. We don't want to stop the usage of these platforms, but they have to have any kind of rule. There's no kind of service provided to anywhere that doesn't have any kind of rule. This is the main issue that we have. We spoke with some authorities from US, LA, Minneapolis, and some cities, from small and big cities, and they are struggling with that. In the bigger cities, they do give the numbers, they do give the information, and they do pay the taxes. In the smaller cities, they say, oh no, come on, I don't want to worry with you yet. Let me survive and do whatever I do, because this is the way that we, as the CEO said once, now we don't ask permission, we excuse later. So there's no way to keep doing business like that. The Uber CEO said this, the previous Uber CEO. You cannot act like this when you talk with people's life and people's transportation. And we cannot rely on private cars to solve urban mobility problems anywhere, in Brazil, United States, or Europe, Asia, and Africa.
Well, I never realized that Baltimore was like Paris in mass transport, public transport. I don't think we are like Paris in public transport. I wish we were. But when you buy a ticket for a Baltimore bus, that ticket pays 40% of the cost of running the system. The state government pays 60% of the cost of running the Baltimore transit system. So at least it's better in one way than yours. Yours is more expensive and you have enough buses. Ours is cheaper and we don't have enough buses.
Yeah.
But as long as people can afford to buy cars, put fuel in cars, and park cars, they will prefer cars. Cars are much more convenient than buses and subways. And if people can afford to buy a car and own a car and use a car, that's what they're going to do. Believe me, we've been trying that in America for 100 years, and that's what people want to do. And you know, we like you, we have cheap fuel for cars. We're not like the Europeans. Our gasoline and diesel cost 40% as much here as they do in Europe, and people drive more. They own more cars.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Okay, Charlie.
Yes.
How do you deal about the density and height issue? because we know that it's the best for mobility and sustainability. But here, I feel that's a problem. In one hand, people complain about the sprawl. In other hand, they complain about the density. How do you deal with this?
Well, the same way you do, by arguing about it. Some people want this, some people want that. Everybody wants more density, but they don't always want it in their neighborhood. And we have lots of historic districts of old houses, which are 2 stories or 3 stories or 4 stories, and you don't want to wreck them. So it is very, very complicated. Where we're getting our density is in places that used to be industrial, or they used to be offices. Old office buildings are being converted to apartments and condominiums. Old factory sites are being converted into new high density neighborhoods. That's an easy way to get a lot of density. And if you want to see another country that does that really brilliantly, the best is the Netherlands, I think. The Netherlands have, Dutch cities have beautiful historic centers with 3-story brick houses from the 1600s. But when you go behind the train station of any Dutch city, you find very high density, brand new apartment houses with fancy contemporary architecture. That's one way to do it. And that's basically what we're doing. We're getting ready to build a big development around our train station. And Philadelphia and Washington are doing that. And New York just built the biggest development project outside of China next to its train station. So, you know, we have here on the East Coast, we have pretty good train service, and people are beginning to realize that it's more convenient than driving. But you're right, building tall and increasing density, these are constant fights. And it's funny, I'm all for having enough density to support walking, to support mass transit. But I'm now leading a fight to prevent cutting up houses in neighborhoods in the center of the city. When you cut up houses, you usually get bad apartments. If you build new apartment buildings, you often get good apartments. You usually get good apartments. That's a good way to do it. And in the center of our city, we have a lot of really beautiful historic buildings and whole historic streets, whole historic neighborhoods. And you have to care for those. You have to, you have to be very careful about those, or else people are not going to want to live in them anymore. So you've put your finger on a huge question, and I would love to know where this is an issue in Porto Alegre and what people are saying for it and against it.
I think you should also talk a little bit about, there is one thing which I was very impressed about Charlie's work in Baltimore. This started with a kind of private initiative, Jubilee. This was well-meaning people, very educated people who put together an NOG or something like that, and uma ONG, and started sort of interacting in city planning with the authorities. And one of the key issues Charlie always talked to me about is building trust. And I think this is one of the issues which I find is so lacking in Porto Alegre, that when there is an initiative from citizens, well-meaning citizens, who try to interact with the authorities, immediately there comes in millions of suspicions. The citizens are suspect of trying to grab power from the city government or the city institutions, and somehow things do not move forward. So I'm always so impressed when Charlie and I talk over the telephone, what are you doing? How is the project going? And he asked me, how is your project going? And I said, oh, forget about it. It's not getting off the ground. So I think you should exchange a little bit ideas, about the conception of what is the power of authority or the competence of authority, and why is it not possible to interact with associations of citizens and things like that?
Okay, now our goal it will be the director plan. Then with this big project, I think it will be the opportunity to talk with the society and discuss every point, and mainly the question of the studies that will come with the plan to support all these things like density, tall building, everything, because with these studies we can prove that the sustainability will be okay, mobility, everything, and discuss with people. I just see the light that the director plan.
Well, one thing I deeply believe, which is that a good city needs to have many different kinds of neighborhoods, many different densities, many different ages. They shouldn't all be the same, and you shouldn't try to make them the same, because people are different, people want different things, and the same person wants one thing when he's 25 years old, and another thing when he's 40, and another thing when he's 60. So, you know, a city needs to have, I think of a city as being like a restaurant, and it needs to have a long menu, a long bill of fare, a long carta of different kinds of neighborhoods. What I find is, you say, how much density do you need to have to be sustainable? If you go to Paris, you have 450 households per hectare. If you go to London, you have only 100 households per hectare, but the cities are equally sustainable. And my guess is that if you have 100 households per hectare on average, you can have a sustainable city. You don't need to have more density than that. You can have more density than that if you want to. But what we call the law of diminishing returns sets in, that, you know, most of America has, you know, 11 households to the hectare, or, you know, New Suburbia has 4 households to the hectare, or 1 household to the hectare. That's just crazy. And where you can make a big difference is in neighborhoods like that, if you can figure out how to introduce density. My favorite, I should have put this in the slideshow, my favorite examples are in Washington, D.C. And in Washington, there are several big avenues. I'm thinking of a street called Connecticut Avenue. Connecticut Avenue has big apartment houses on both sides, all along, elevators, lifts, high density. And then behind those apartment houses are houses, row houses or freestanding houses, fairly low density. And it works. The apartment houses give enough density for shops and public transport. And then you have houses where families are raising children, and they can walk to shops and they can use public transport. It's magical. Washington has done something really brilliant. And I don't think it was anybody's plan. It just kind of happened. It took 100 years to do. And then at a higher density, London does the same thing in neighborhoods like Kensington. But if you put apartment buildings on your big, busy commercial streets, you can then have quite low density behind those big commercial streets, and you'll still be sustainable.
Okay, I would like to announce that our director Claudia Marquez, she got into. So, hello Claudia, very nice to have you with us. Would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you very much, Catherine. It's an honor to be here. I'm following the very interesting discussion, and I want to thank in name of our center. Professor Drayton was here also. The collaboration from Professor Charles Duff and the colleagues from EPTC, from our President Fabio Bergwanger, and also Secretario Rodrigo Torniello, and the colleague from the PPG, Secretary Rovana, and also Carol Correa. And I think this discussion is so important that perhaps we should think about a publication about this. I think the center should be, if Catherine Rosenfield agree, also a place to exchange futures view how is possible to be more sustainable in the cities. So I'm delighted to hear the discussion, and perhaps we should think to make a joint publication with the very interesting presentation that are here, and also perhaps for our students also to be more reflexive about the possibilities and also the problems that are raised. So thank you very much, Professor Charles Duff, for this interesting point of view. And I hope we are not closing the debate. We are just open the new possibility for our center to follow this important subject. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you very
break.
much. This is a wonderful opportunity for me. Thank you. I love to get, you're coming to me from a different world, and I'm learning a huge amount, and I love it.
Well, it has been very challenging to listen to everything you've said, and to listen to all of the possibilities and problems, because, you know, one of the interesting things is that a city like Porto Alegre does have a really good transport system. I mean, it's not good for me, you know, for an elderly lady getting on our buses is quite a challenge, particularly if you live on the top of a hill and have to walk to the station for quite some time. But my kids tell me that, you know, they love the public transportation system in Porto Alegre. And considering that it's working, even though there isn't that support of public money, you know, to pay for 60% of the costs, I think it's quite amazing that we do have it. So I must say I admire public transportation in Porto Alegre more after this talk than before it. And I wanted to thank you very much for the presentation, and maybe we could engage in other exchanges of idea with Rovana, with Rodrigo, Fabio, and you know, the more expert people from our center, in order to put together a list of issues which might enhance further studies or research and exchange of ideas with the authorities, because I think that's the main idea of our center, you know, to create links between researchers at the universities and public officials in order to look for ways in order to carry out these ideas. So your expertise and experience, of course, will be very helpful with all that.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And I would like to, eu também gostaria de agradecer agora em português para Rovana, para Rodrigo, para Fábio pela presença. Obrigada também para Cláudia e Drayton pelo apoio, né, do CDEA. E nós vamos anunciar quando será o próximo encontro. I hope we will have you back at another time for another talk, and probably I will ask you to write a little something about that so we can put together a publication.
Good.
Thank you very much, and see you again next time.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Good.
Goodbye.
Thank you
Goodbye.
very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
Thank you. So nice to meet
Ciao,
you.
Carol.
Nice to meet you. Bye. Thank
Good.
you.
Bye-bye. Off we go.
Ciao, Rovana.